Welcome back to part 2 of working with text files with Python. What we're going to do now is go over how to read and write to basic text files with just the built-in capabilities of the standard Python library. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's begin by actually creating a text file. The method I'm going to use is specific to Jupyter Notebooks, and it's a magic command. You do %, these are known as magic commands that work with Jupyter Notebook, and then you type out write file, spaced, and then the name of your file will say test for test.txt for text file. And then immediately below this line, you can begin writing your text file text. So I can say, hello, this is a quick test file, period, and we'll say this is the second line of the file. Keep in mind, if you are not using Jupyter Notebook, just use a standard text editor like Sublime Text Editor or Atom Text Editor to save a .txt file. Again, this specific line and what's written here in this cell only works for the Jupyter Notebook system. So please, if you're not using Jupyter Notebooks, just open up a basic text editor and save this as a text file. Go ahead and run this, and you should see as the output writing test.txt. Keep in mind you can't have any comment above this line, it just needs to look exactly as written here. Now that I have this test.txt file, I should be able to open it. The first thing you should do whenever you're opening a text file, regardless of what library you're using, is make sure you understand the file's location. To open up a file, you first create the variable, and then you say equals to, and Python has a built-in keyword called open, and then in parentheses you pass in the path to the file. If you happen to provide a file that isn't there, for example, let's go ahead and make up a file name like whoops.txt. If you run this, you'll get a file not found error, and it'll say error number 2, no such file or directory whoops.txt. If you ever get this error number 2, that means you're either providing the wrong file path or you misspelled the actual file name. So keep in mind, to avoid this error, you should have a good awareness of where this notebook is currently located, as well as where your text file is currently located. To figure out where your notebook is currently located, you can simply type pwd into a cell, run it, and it will tell you where you're currently located. So right now, I'm located at users, Marcial, desktop, NLP course. That means I should probably have my text files there if I want to open them with this open command. So now let's actually grab the test.txt file that we wrote. Keep in mind, it's easy to make typos here. This is test.txt. So what we're going to do is say my file is equal to open, and always be careful not to commit a typo here. We'll type test.txt. And when you run this, you now have your file open. And if you actually look at the my file object, it should just tell you something like this is a wrapper ready to go for this text file, and by default it reads it with a mode R, which means reading, and we'll talk about modes in more detail later on in this lecture. But keep in mind, if you ever get this error number 2, it means you're either passing in the wrong file path or you misspelled the actual file name. In general, the easiest way to go about this is to make sure your text files are in the same location as your notebook is, and you can always figure out the location of your notebook with pwd. If you want to open files that are in another location on your computer, you can just pass in the entire file path. Let me show you an example of that by copying and pasting from this lecture's notebook. Alright, I copied and pasted this little markdown cell from the notebook, and what it does is it just gives you an example of passing in the entire file path. If you're on a Windows computer, typically you need to use a double backslash so that Python doesn't treat the second backslash as an escape character. And you'll notice that that format was followed here when I actually typed pwd. So pwd stands for print working directory. And again, if you want to open a text file that's located in a different folder than your notebook, you just need to provide the entire file path. So for example, if you're on Windows, it would look something like this: C drive, double backslash, users, your username, etc., all the way until you find your .txt file. Always keep in mind that sometimes text files don't actually explicitly call this txt extension. Maybe it's just my file. If you're on macOS or Linux, you're going to use forward slashes. It'll look something like this: users, your username, folder, etc. Again, just to make it very clear, if you're ever getting this error number 2, likelihood is you did a typo or you're providing the wrong file path. So please always debug that on your own first before posting to the Q&A forums. Okay, so now that we've opened up the file, we have it saved as this my file and it's this text.io wrapper object. What we can do is we can read the file. And the way you do that is simply by saying myfile.read, open and close parentheses, run that, and it will read the file. And notice what happened here. It says, hello, this is a quick text file, and then we get this \n. That \n is an indicator for a new line. So if we look at the original text file, it said, hello, this is a quick test file. This is the second line of the test file. That new line is indicated with this \n. Now, what's interesting is if I were to try to read this file again, it suddenly shows up blank. So this is often a point of confusion for beginners with Python or reading in text files with Python, is that you can't just call read multiple times on a file. Essentially what's going on is you have a cursor at the very beginning of a text file, and after you call .read, that cursor goes throughout the entire text file and then returns the entire file as a string, as we can see here, and then the cursor is sitting at the end of the file, which means when you call read again, it's just going to read from the cursor all the way to the end of the file, which in this case, since we already called read, there's nothing there. It's just an empty string. In order to fix this, what we need to do is call myfile.seek, and then you can change the cursor to index position 0, which essentially resets the cursor. It'll report back, okay, the cursor now is at index 0, meaning the cursor is now at the beginning of the text file, and I can call read again. So myfile.read, and here I see the entire string again. So .read is really useful for smaller files where you just want to grab everything and then save it as a string. So let's go ahead and seek 0 again. So I can say maybe content is equal to myfile.read, run that, and now content is going to be this saved string of the file. And since it has this \n, if I ever actually want to print the content, it'll take that into account and then it'll display it as necessary. So it'll take into account those escape characters and print out the new line. And keep in mind now, content is actually the literal string. I no longer need to worry about this seek reading capability off the file. Okay, so that's how you can read in the file as a string. The last thing you should know is you should always close a file once you're done working with it. So you can close a file simply by saying myfile.close, shift enter, and now that file object has been closed. The reason you want to make sure to do that is just in case you try opening that text file with another program, if you still have it open in Python, it may cause issues with your operating system. If you've ever tried to pull out a USB drive and it said, hey, some files are still under use, that's the sort of thing that happens if you don't close a file. It'll basically say, hey, Python is using this text file, I can't open it right now. So always make sure to close your files. Now we just saw how the .read method off a file object returns the entire text file as one large string. Often it would be nice is if we could iterate through each line in the text file. Notice that each line is essentially segmented by this \n. Luckily, Python actually has a readLines method in addition to the read method, which will actually read in each line as a separate item in a Python list. Let's go ahead and show you what that looks like. I'm going to open up the file again. So we'll say my file is equal to open, and as a string, I'm going to say tst.txt. And in general, you should be able to tab autocomplete this. That's another good indication that you're in the right place. So I just opened the text file, and instead of saying .read, I'm actually going to hit tab here, and notice that I have this read lines. That's another really useful method. And what this does is if you run this, it's going to read in each line as a separate item in the list. And it's going to use this \n as the last item for, or basically the last set of characters for each item in this list. So now what I could do is let me go back, seek at 0, and then I could say my lines is equal to myfile.readLines, run that, and now I have this myLines object, which is a list of every string, or essentially every line as a string, And then I could iterate through that. So I can say for line in my lines, and then I can do stuff with it. Maybe like print out the first character of each line, which would be line 0. So run that, and now I see the first character in each of these lines. And you can begin doing additional things. Maybe you want to split that actual string into separate words, and then grab the first item there. And that's going to return back essentially the first set of characters before a space for each line. And you can begin to experiment, but that's why read lines is also a very useful method. And it's often more common to see read lines than just .read, but it really depends on the situation. You should be familiar with both. So read is to grab everything as one giant string. Read lines is to grab every line as a separate string for a list. Okay, so we just saw how we can read from a file. Now let's talk about writing to a file. By default, that open function that we just used up here, it only allows us to read the file. And that's really for safety because by default, you probably don't want to just have any user have write access to your text files. Otherwise, they'll be able to overwrite anything. But let's show you how to actually write to a file, and then we'll talk about appending to a file. Let's go ahead and show this. So I'm going to say my file is equal to open, and I'm going to open that test.txt file again, except as a second parameter, if you do Shift Tab here, you should notice that you pass in the file name and you have pass in this mode parameter where the default mode is R, which is reading. And if you hit plus here, you should be able to expand on this. And you scroll down, it'll have a little character table for character versus meaning. So R is open for reading, W is open for writing, and then if you add this little plus, it opens a disk for updating, reading, and writing. So a really common way to see this is by saying W plus. And there's a lot more discussion here of all the various methods, but we're just kind of focused on the simple ones. So we're just going to say W plus. And passing W plus allows us to both read and write to the file. Now, what's interesting here is that W plus should be used with caution. If you open a file with W or W plus, it performs a truncation on the original. That means anything in the original file is actually overwritten and deleted over. So I want to show this by running, and I'm going to say my file, and let's quickly read what is in the file right now. You'll notice that immediately my file, after calling .read, has been an empty string, because by opening it with W+, you're now overwriting the original test.txt file. So that's why you should use W and W+ with caution. You should only use it when you intend to completely overwrite the original contents of the file. So notice now, if I say my file, I can call the write method and say my brand new text. So now it wrote some text, it returns back the number of characters that were written. And if you say my file seek 0 and run that, and then say my file, if we just call read here, notice now it says my brand new text. We no longer have the original text lines up here, which was hello, this is a quick test file, this is the second line of the file. And that's because opening with W and W+ will completely overwrite the original file. Now, in a lot of use cases, that's actually what you want to do. If you're trying to create a updating log or just create a new file every time someone runs a program, you may very well want to completely overwrite any old information. But in case you don't, there's also an append method, which we're going to show you next. So keep in mind, if you want to write to a file, you should open it with W or W+. So W+ allows you to both read and write to the file. And then let's go ahead and close this file. And now that file is closed. So you should always do that when you're done with a file. We just showed you how to read from a file and how to write to a file. Let's now show you how to append to a file. So the appending to a file will actually keep the old information and then allow you to add in new lines. So let's try that out. We're going to say my file is equal to open, and I'm going to open that text file again, except this time I'm going to say A+, which now allows me to open it by being able to append to the file instead of completely overwriting it. So if the file doesn't exist, a new one is going to be created. So keep in mind that if you accidentally pass in a file here that completely doesn't exist, such as whoops.txt, instead of producing an error, if you're opening it with a+, it's actually going to then create a new file called whoops.txt. So keep that in mind. We're going to say my file dot write, and here we're going to say is my first line in a+ opening. And let's go ahead and close the file. And now let's open the file again. So we'll say new file is equal to open. And I'm just going to open it now in read permission. So whoops.txt here. And if I say new file read, I see my first line in a+ opening. So what actually happened here, since I opened with a+, I opened a file that didn't exist, so then it said, okay, I'll go ahead and make one for you. Keep in mind, that's not the case when you're opening with the mode R. It'll say, hey, there's an error here, that file doesn't exist. But since you open with a+, it says, no problem, I'll create that file for you. Then we write to that file, close it. If I'm opening it with just read permission, there I can see my first line in a+ opening. Keep in mind, the default here was mode and read permission, which means if I say new file dot write, I'll say try to write something with only read permissions, I suddenly get an error. It says, hey, that's not writable. And that's because we only opened this file, this new file object, with mode R, which is the default mode. So if you're ever getting this error, it's because you didn't open it with the correct permission or the correct mode. So let's close this file again. New file, close. And I'm going to open up again this whoops.txt file. Again, that's the one we just created. We'll say my file is equal to open whoops.txt. I'm going to say mode is equal to a+, so it allows me to append to it. And then I will say my file. And then I'm going to say write. And then say this is an added line because I used a plus mode. And now, if I seek all the way to the beginning of the file, and then say my file read, I see this is an added line because I used a plus mode. Notice how it's writing everything onto the first line. If you actually want to add in a real new line, what you would have to do is take your file and then say write, and then the very first character would actually have to be a line break. You'd have to say \n for a new line, and then say this is a real new line on the next line. And then run that. And now again, I will seek all the way to the beginning of the file, read the file again, and now I see my first line in a+ opening, this is an added line, etc. And then I see \n, this is a real new line on the next line. So if I were to seek back to 0, and then print out the results of my file.read, I see this. My first line a+ opening, this is an added line, this is a real new line. Now before we end this lecture, the last thing I want to show you is how you can actually use a context manager to automatically close the file for you. So previously we always had to say my file close. Because that's kind of annoying and it's also a little unsafe because you may forget to write that close line, there's an alias in context manager which allows you to use the with keyword to say with open test.txt or whatever file you're working with. So let's go ahead and just use that whoops file since we know we have a lot for it. We can say whoops.txt. I'm just going to read it in with write permission, and then we'll say as my new file, colon, and then we can do whatever we want here. So I can say something like, my variable is equal to my new file dot read lines. So what's actually happening here, this is just known as a context manager. It's going to say with, you open this file as this variable name, and you can do whatever you want in this block of code and it will automatically close the file once this block of code is done running for you. So you run that, and then if you call my variable, it's this list now based off those lines. So often we're going to see us performing the with open command instead of having to manually open and close files ourselves. This with operator is a context manager that automatically closes the file for you. And that's really what you see most professionals using. But it is important to understand the basics because that's essentially what's going on under the hood when you call this with context manager. All right, coming up next, we're going to learn how to work with PDF files. We'll see you there.